Record. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We are here today to talk about fall gardening tasks, getting ready to put your garden to bed for the winter time. I'm going to be your teacher this evening, your speaker, and sharing some tips and techniques I've learned over the years. But I absolutely 100% encourage you to chime in on ideas that you have as we're going along here. Looks like we got a smallish group, and so I definitely encourage folks to share any tips and techniques that they would like to, that they really have found useful for them with gardening over the years. Just if you don't know me, I guess I'll start out. My name is Keto. I work for Keep Growing Detroit. I coordinate our education programming, amongst other things. And today I'm going to be covering the topic of fall gardening. So without further ado, I guess let's put it this way. So we got a small group. Feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go along. If there's anything particularly on your mind about the subject matter, please, drop your questions in the chat or comments or other resources that you would like to share. Or you can also just, if I'm, in between slides, you can come off mute if you want to just chime in and share what's on your mind. Sound good? Okay. Right on. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to the slides. Okay. Oh, how is it doing that? Okay. All right. You see that, guys? Yep. All right. So fall, it does not feel like fall yet, especially on a day like today, does it? 70, what was it, 75 today, 77? I was looking at the forecasts, and it's so, I don't know. I remember it's not that, it just seems like every year the warm weather just kind of extends further and further into the end of the year. But I just remember it being a lot cooler at this time of year in the past, but I'm sure it's on the horizon. But we're going to be, basically the idea here is, we know that the garden, has got it thrives with the basics of what plants need, right? So our gardens need warm temperatures and sunlight and access to water and fertility. So access to water and fertility we have some control over, but warm temperatures and sunlight, our days are getting shorter and shorter, and so the garden is just slowly, the plants are getting ready to go dormant, and we'll talk about the various types of plants and how they are affected differently kind of as we go along here. This is just an illustration of thinking about sunlight and thinking about the year and how that kind of plays into, what we need to do as gardeners. So, basically at the height of the season, at the summer equinox, or the longest day of the year in June would be usually the 21st. And that's when basically from the springtime until then, the plants are working overtime, and they'll grow. You'll go out in your garden and you can see them. It's almost like you can see them growing because they're growing so fast. Some things you go out there in the morning and look at the plant, and then you come back out in the evening and it's already bigger. So as the daylight wanes as we get towards this time of the season, and we're getting towards basically the time of the year where the sunlight dips below where plants can actively grow, which is, less than 10 hours of sunlight. So it's not only, it's a combination of things, but the lack of sunlight is is a huge factor there. Okay, so here's a general overview of what we're going to be discussing today, and just kind of a general checklist of tasks. Basically thinking about looking at your garden as it exists, and thinking about how, what changes you might make, what went well, what didn't go well, how you might improve that. Thinking about plans for a new garden, or if you're planning on getting a start with some new beds or anything, and some tasks that you could do related to that. There are some options of things that you could still plant at this time of the season, and we'll talk about those more in detail. Cleanup of perennials, and what to do specifically around different perennials, and considerations for that. Managing and taking care of cleaning up our garden beds with the annual vegetable crops. Planting things like bulbs and garlic. Splitting and dividing, and maybe even giving to your friends other perennial plants. So this is a good time to change, do some changes in your garden, as well as early spring is another time for that. And then thinking about, if you want to try and grow things indoors, things like microgreens, or once you get into the, get closer to the springtime, if you wanted to start your own plants indoors, we'll talk a little bit about that. So I guess since we have a smallish group, I'd like to take a minute and just get a sense of what's on your mind. If there's anything that any questions in particular that you were hoping to address today, if you wouldn't mind dropping those in the chat. I'm going to stop screen for a second. And then if you could drop those in the chat, or feel free to just come off mute is another option. What's on your mind? Okay. I hear nothing yet. Okay. So we'll come back to that. Okay. So I want you to just be thinking about that as we're going along. Okay. So let's kind of get started with the things that are probably the priority if you're going to do them at all. And so that would be things that you might be planting at this time of the season. Just to note that starting seeds now has some risk. It's basically like it may or may not work out, but the garden is all about experimentation, on any scale. You gotta, there's things that you learn how to do, and then you get to do, how to do them year after year after year, and they'll be successful for you once you have that kind of trick under your belt. But sometimes you want to try things, and experiment a little bit. So if you're thinking about starting some vegetable seeds at this time, I would really focus on, so likely, because the day lengths are shorter, things take longer to develop. And so a lot of what you might start now, you might be planting for intentions of really harvesting in the springtime, with a little bit of protection, like using quick hoops or row cover, or even just a little bit of straw. But the idea here is that basically, you can definitely plant things now, and we have, some decently warm days still under our belt here with, you could, get things to germinate nicely. And, basically about a month from now, is when the days dip below 10 hours of sunlight. And so the plants won't be growing much past that. So in theory, you could grow, like, there are a few things that would, if you planted now, could grow enough to develop to be able to be harvested before the end of the year. I would say the short list there would be any kind of baby greens or baby lettuce. And then spinach is an absolute awesome fall crop. I highly recommend that one. That would probably be the number one thing I would recommend trying. And then radishes is another good one because they develop super quickly. They're like 28 days to harvest. So what likely, and then, so some of these things, well, and this is kind of plays into the conversation about season extension and growing under, some kind of protection, whether that be a cold frame or a quick hoop or something. I'm using some terminology here. Please ask questions. Actually, I need a favor, because when I'm in presentation mode, I cannot see the chat. So would somebody be willing to just keep an eye on the chat for me? Maybe Lorraine, would you be willing to do that?
Yes, I can do that.
Okay, great. Yeah, so if anything, if I'm using any terminology that isn't familiar, let me know, like quick hoops or whatever. In any case, right, so we're trying to, if we're basically, if we're trying to start things now, we might get a harvest before the springtime. It really depends on how the weather goes. We've been having some really warm falls into like some warmish weather even into like December the past several years, so that could bode well for being able to get things to establish well and maybe get a harvest. But at the very least, you could be getting something like spinach started, and even if it didn't take off, as soon as the day lengths get longer in the springtime, like February, by the middle of February into March, and we get things start to warm up and we get some longer days, then those things will kick off right away, and so you can get as good of a harvest as you possibly can in that circumstance. So it's definitely something to play around with. In that case, I would really focus on spinach in particular. Carrots is another really good one for that. And maybe some of the greens mixes, like not the lettuce mix. Lettuce, when it gets any kind of deep freeze, like if we get any kind of deep freezing in say January, which is pretty common, lettuces will kind of crap out if they get that kind of freezing temperatures, but spinach can totally handle it. And the Asian, the greens mixes can totally handle it. Mustard greens would be another one. You can try radishes, turnips, I'm sorry, salad turnips would be another one. So like if you got the salad turnips from the Garden Resource Program distribution, then that would be another one.
Keto, we have a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
One is, what's the best way to grow herbs in the house?
Okay. Well, it depends on the herb, because there are some herbs that are pretty easy to start from seed, and they grow relatively well, even like if you just had a grow light. So the short answer to that is so there's annual herbs and there's perennial herbs. If there's any herb in particular that you want to know about, shout it out, but I'll just try and summarize here. So if you're growing indoors in any capacity, unless it's something perennial like rosemary, if you're trying to do like annual herbs like cilantro or dill or basil, things like that, you're going to probably want to have some kind of grow light setup, which you can get pretty inexpensively. Either you're using a shop light, there's some great LED options these days, which you can either get at the big box stores that are specifically designed for growing indoors, or you can get them from places like Amazon or whatever, or hardware store. But the short of it is, I would say, maybe those three would be would probably do pretty well. You would get, they'd be short, but you'd still be able to get some good harvests off of them. And then there's perennial things like rosemary is one of those herbs that it is perennial, but it is not cold hardy. So that's something that you would, that works well to keep in a pot and then just keep in a cold room in your house, in kind of indirect sunlight. Some people are really, and that's one, I've been gardening for years. I have success with lots of things, but I never have success with rosemary. I have friends who always are able to pull them through the winter and they bring them in their houses. I don't know what it is. They're arid plants, so maybe I water them too much, but every friend, it's like I feel bad because every year around Christmas, my friend gives me a rosemary plant. And I'm like, I just kill them, man. I'm sorry. But in any case, okay, other questions.
Do you do a raised bed differently for putting garden to bed?
No, a lot of the things that, and I'll try and keep that in mind as we're going along here.
Okay.
A lot of the concepts apply pretty similarly to a raised bed, right?
Okay.
Okay.
Will the slides be, will you be sending the slides out after?
Yes. Yes, I'm recording,
Okay.
I'm recording today, so we'll have the video that'll be on our YouTube channel, and yes, I will be sharing the slides.
Okay. Okay. I guess everything else you probably kind of answered.
Okay,
Um,
other things that that we would be thinking about planting this time of year, and this kind of goes outside of vegetable gardening, but beauty is a very important about beauty is a very important aspect of our gardens. And I think after being cooped up all winter long, spring flowering bulbs are are a real delight. And so this is the time of year to be planting bulb flowers like tulips and daffodils and snowdrops and there's many of them. If you are, you can you can get a lot of those still at the big box stores or the garden centers, like um um all of those, any of the local garden center type places, but you can also order them online. There's a White Flower Farm is one example of an online company that does bulbs, and they have, the fun part about those companies is like that's all they do, so you can get some really fun and unique ones. It's fun to have ones that naturalize, that ultimately over time they multiply. So like you could do, like we do grape hyacinths and snowdrops in our lawn, and so like when they're over time they've been kind of spreading and spreading, and so you got to get this early patches of color in your lawn before the season really starts and the grass starts growing, and it's just it's a nice thing to brighten the springtime or the pre-springtime. Definitely this time of year is time for planting garlic, and I believe garlic distributions are happening next week starting with the GRP. I don't have those details off the top of my head, but I could either share them in the email but just know that if you're interested in garlic from us, distributions are coming up. And this is the time of year to plant garlic. Garlic's real easy and real easy to plant. The biggest thing to remember about garlic is that you're planting it now for harvesting it next year around July. So wherever you plant it, say you put it in your raised bed, that spot's occupied. So there's not much else, it's just something like we get to our gardens in the springtime and we're like ready to pounce and plant everything that we can. And we go, oh, I forgot there's garlic there. One other tip about planting is this is a real good time of year to get discount perennials. So if you're looking to spruce up your perennial garden beds, you want to get more pollinators in your gardens, you want some more flowers, you want some more beauty, this is a great time to head out to those garden centers, probably in the next month or so, Telly's and places like that, and see what they have. They basically, they don't want to winterize, they don't want to keep that stuff over the winter because there's a chance, because they have it just in pots, they're not putting it in the ground, there's a chance it won't survive or it won't look so good next year. So they just want to, they want to clear their decks so so they don't have to manage that stuff. So they usually sell it at a discount. It's also a really good time of year to divide a lot of perennials. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, how we doing? Good. Okay. Okay, things to keep around, things to not get rid of yet. A lot of our vegetables that we have planted in our gardens will continue to be able to be harvested into the winter months, particularly the cold crops, of course. So essentially, hot crops, um, anything that's fruiting is probably looking pretty sad right now already. Like I just did a walkthrough in my own garden, and my tomatoes are just about done. I've had a few tomatoes on these vines that they're just not, they're big enough, but they're just not ripening. It's been a month, and I'm like, oh, okay. But yeah, I just like, it's a daylight thing. But essentially, anything fruiting is done, so you can pull those up. Um, and so we're gonna, but what I'm focusing on here is what things that you want to keep. So that's things like kale and collards. They'll keep going, especially if we have a mild winter. If we get a hard frost, sometimes that'll knock them down. But even with, a little bit of protection, like some row cover, or like the quick hoops, which is like a little hoop cover you put the row cover on top of, as providing a little kind of tent-like situation, works real nicely, um, for giving them a little bit of protection so you can keep harvesting. Just note that if with any of those cold crops, you know, inspect them if they're really, sometimes they get really hit with aphids, or the pests look, did a job on them. If they're looking pretty ragged, then it's maybe time to go. Just pull them up. And in that case, definitely, dispose of them. You either want to put them in a really active compost pile. If there's any kind of pest or disease infestation on any of the plant material, you either want to put in a hot compost pile that's gonna cook really fast, which not all of us have, or dispose of it offsite. Maybe take it to, um, like put it in with your waste disposal, your city waste disposal, like when they collect leaves, yard waste, that kind of stuff. Um, so pros and cons of that. So like the pros is definitely going to be able to be keep harvesting there. Cons is like, you want to if you can, you want to give your soil a rest, and you want to and particularly we're going to be talking a little bit later about how to like basically protect the soil, with some kind of mulching options. Um, Moving on to talking about some of the perennial things and flowering plants, like your perennial flowers or perennial fruits and vegetables. So um, okay, so let's just talk about like if you have hostas or daylilies, or anything that's like a leafy garden plant, which, by the way, side note, you can actually eat the tubers of daylilies, and you can actually eat the young shoot sprouts of hostas. So they are technically edible plants. But anything that's kind of leafy is probably, you're just going to, ultimately they're just going to die back to the ground anyway. So the choice there is to leave it, or which, provides some cover for the soil, and which is a good thing, or to just cut it back. And one of the reasons we want to, some of the plants that especially anything flowering plant with seed heads, or stalks, like there's the stalks of like like milkweed, we want to consider leaving in the garden, because those provide food and habitat for a lot of beneficial, wildlife. Birds in the winter love things like echinacea, spent echinacea heads, or purple coneflower, or I mean, the list goes on and on. Basically any flowering plant that is spent, but that you can still see the seed head. It's not a bad idea to leave those up for wildlife during the winter. I know some people are real neat and tidy and they want things to look fresh and clean. So if you need to do a little spruce up and do a compromise, somewhere in between of like cutting back the ones that are falling over or look a little ratty and tidy up a little bit, maybe that's a good way to go. Another thing to do is if you have any kind of new plantings, that, you know, most of these perennials are, they die back all the way to the ground. So you may kind of lose track of them, especially like on the previous slide, I was talking about, you know, planting new plants that you got on sale. So be sure and put a tag in there, make sure that, you know, that something's there. So you don't end up knocking it over or stepping on it when you're doing your garden work in the springtime before it starts to leaf out. So this is also, as I mentioned before, this is also a good time to divide and transplant perennials. So you could divide hostas, you can divide daylilies. There's lots of, and I don't have an exhaustive list. Maybe I should add that, add a note to make sure I add a list of those things that, but I would say as a general rule, if it's an herbaceous perennial, and herbaceous basically means it's not woody, it's like the leaves on a hosta or the leaves on a daylily, or like it's something that dies to the ground every year. Most, I would say, if they spread in any way, if they're getting bigger over time, irises, a lot of those, you know, if they're getting bigger over time, that means that they likely can be divided. And you can do that, you know, you can basically do that by taking a shovel and just cutting it in half, just dividing up the root. Sometimes you can tease them apart. Things like daylilies, you could kind of, when you dig them up, you can see the little bulbets of their root system, and you can spread those around. This is also a time of year that you would dig up to keep any kind of tender perennials, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. I'll name off some of those. Another note here is that some of the self-seeded, you know, some of the crops that we grow in our gardens will readily self-seed if we leave them to go to seed. So if I have dill all over my garden that just pops up, I have a nice carpet of dill on one little part of my garden, just because I usually let them go to flower, and then the seed heads have already spread. But here's a list of things like arugula, calendula, chamomile, cilantro. If you let those, you know, go to fully to seed, and you just kind of leave them in your garden, they will readily self-seed next year. So a little bonus, and save you some time and energy. And then summertime, nasturtiums and basil will do something. Basil and zinnias will do similar. Oh, I'm going to talk a little bit more about mulching, but just to a little bit later, but just to note, if you're doing anything about this self-seeding concept, if you're trying to do this self-seeding concept, that the seeds need to land on open soil. If they can't land on mulched leaves or straw, kind of get lost in the mix. So, you know, it's a judgment call in that situation.
Keto, someone wants to know if tarragon, if you need to cut that back.
Tarragon is a perennial. So I would say you could kind of do a final harvest on it to dry it and save it, or use it fresh. I would, so with, and I guess that's a good, before we start talking about cutting things back and removing more, you know, you have a little time yet, like, you know, it's not gonna, you could start your fall cleanup right now. Once we get a little bit colder weather, the plants will start to die back on their own, and maybe that's you know, following that kind of indicator might be a good idea. But yeah, with herbs like tarragon, you would essentially be cutting it back to ground level. Any other ones? No. Okay,
That was it.
okay. Um. So, um. So yeah, just in terms of generally speaking, this is the time frame to do our final harvest. Um, you can harvest all your tender greens, like your things that are more tender would be like chard and lettuces. Um, and before we start to get the frost, because they will get hit by the frost. Um, Sweet potatoes, anything that essentially like any kind of end of the season that you haven't pulled up yet. Green tomatoes, um, you can either just harvest them and cook them as green tomatoes, but if you want, as long as they're like somewhat, you still want them to ripen. If they are past kind of the green stage and they're more like green turning to white stage, they probably would ripen. They'll ripen kind of most readily if you put them in like a paper bag or in a box or something. So um, the natural chemicals inside them that cause them to ripen will concentrate, so to stimulate them uh, to get some color. So let's see. Just a note that if you're, usually we have a few seasonal indicators of kind of when we can get started in the spring with the last frost date. And then at this time of year, we're thinking about when do we expect the first frost date, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of October 23rd. It seems to kind of it seems to kind of vary. But that's just kind of another indicator of like, okay, I know before I'm gonna shoot to get shoot to get all my stuff harvested and out of the garden before October 23rd, so I don't lose any of it. Um, yeah, and essentially, any like by September, any hot crops, if they're not fruiting already, they're probably not gonna, like, if they have a fruit on them and it's starting to develop, then you'll probably still get some decent harvests off of it, still be able to harvest those at the ripe stage. But if they're flowering or if they're not flowering at all, then they're done. Like I pulled in my own garden, I pulled half of my tomatoes 3 weeks ago because they were pretty much done. They weren't really fruiting anymore. And but I left some of the other plants because they still had some fruit on them, and I wanted to try and get them to harvest on the vine. Um, And as I mentioned before, any plants that have any kind of disease issues, in particular, like powdery mildew, or if you have any kind of thing that that was a blight, try and remove it altogether and put it out with the bulk yard waste instead of putting it in a compost pile, just to remove the possibility of that being an issue with contamination in the garden. Um, if you're harvesting things like sweet potatoes and squashes, a note that you should cure them to get the sugars to mature, to develop, to get the full flavor. So bring those inside, put them in a warm spot, 80 to 85 degrees for roughly 10 days. That could be something like someplace like your attic would be a good spot if we, unless, or you could just turn up your thermostat to 85 and just, live in Florida for a few days. And then once they're, after they've cured, then you can store them in a cool, dark place, something like your basement, and then you should be able to get some decent storage off of them. So storage crops are, potatoes and carrots and, are some of the other storage crops. A note that, you can play around with having, if you want to experiment, you can play around with uprooting things like anything in the brassica family to get some winter what are shoot production or a little small growth production off of. So that would be things like broccoli or Brussels sprouts or collards or kale. If you just uprooted them out of the garden and then basically put their roots in sand in a corner in your basement, and then once we get longer days, start to get a little bit of longer days in the early spring, you can get those under a light or in some sunshine, and you might get some shoots off of them. It's not a big harvest. It's something fun to play around with, but just something to think about. Definitely, when we're doing cleanups, just keep in mind that the city ordinance is especially if your garden is in street view, the ordinance says dead garden plants must be removed no later than the 30th of November. And if you missed it last week, we did a really great session on seed saving. We're kind of winding down the season, but there are a lot of things that maybe are ripe seeds in your garden. Beans would be a good example of that. If you still have tomatoes, you could be saving seeds from those. So just keep that on your mind, that seed saving requires a little terminology and stuff, but anybody can seed save, and you should definitely try it if you haven't done it already. It's good stuff. Right. So here's in terms of tender bulbs, there are some things that we plant out each season that need to be brought indoors for the winter and stored either in some sand or some perlite or vermiculite. And so calla lilies, gladiolas, dahlias, elephant ears, things like that. One more note is if you have any kind of perennial weeds in your garden, if you have the time and energy to knock them back really well in the fall, it's a good time because they put a lot of energy. They're trying to put energy into, storing, putting into their roots to store for the winter. So if you can really knock them back, dig them out a little bit, pull and cut off the tops, all that kind of stuff will just diminish their food stores in their root system and make it easier to ultimately, get rid of them.
Okay, Keto, we have a couple of things in the chat.
Okay, great.
You talked about broccoli, but they want to know about eggplants. What do you do with eggplants?
Eggplant would be a hot crop, a fruiting crop that you would want to do your final harvest on, and then compost the rest of the plant.
Okay. Please share tips on installing row covers.
Okay. So row cover, if you're not familiar, is basically it looks like a sheet. It's spun bound plastic, so it's basically this white sheet type stuff that it's used for three main functions. It's used for winter protection, which we're talking about today. It's used for keeping pests out, and it's used for oh boy, pests, winter. I'm totally spacing. It'll come to me. But in any case, we're trying to basically, if we're using it for winter protection, we're using it like something akin to a tent. So we want a little like tent, either a wire or how I mentioned the quick hoops, and that's basically a piece of conduit that you are putting over your beds, and then you're putting the row cover over that to provide some protection, like a little area. So check out, if you're really interested in that, check out my video we did about a month ago on season extension. Basically you can use electrical metal conduit, which you can get from the hardware store for like $5 a piece. So like you would use 3 consecutive hoops Here, actually, it's a lot easier to show an image. Right, so let me like this picture. So this guy, basically, they're using these bent hoops. And then they're using the row cover over it with,
Oh,
with weights, with bags. Basically, you can take a grocery bag and just fill it with soil or compost and use that as weights on the edges to keep the wind from blowing it around. So that's the basic concept. You can also use, you can get what's called number 9 wire from the hardware store. It's like a thick gauge wire that comes in a round spool, and then you just cut it to lengths, and then you can stretch it out and stick it in the ground, and then it basically holds the row cover so that it's not touching the plants. And the idea here is that if it was touching the plants and you got frost, then that wouldn't really help you. But because it's kind of suspended above it, it gives some frost protection.
okay. What is the white cotton on wood chips?
Oops, I didn't mean to do that. White cotton on wood chips.
Mm-hmm.
I am not sure, but I would guess that's probably some kind of fungal growth. I wouldn't worry about it too much, depending on where you have the wood chips. But if it's in your perennial beds, it's probably not going to be problematic. But that would be my best guess.
Okay. And I still have eggplant growing slowly. Harvest before frost. Does the eggplant have to be harvested before the frost?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not, I would say, I don't know how much bigger they're going to get at this time of year. Maybe. Why not try it for another week or two? But you maybe just cut your losses and harvest them, because you can harvest them at any size. You can harvest them the size of a golf ball and they'll still be, perfectly edible. But okay. Right. So now we're talking about other aspects of kind of cleanup. We already talked about removing plants and discarding diseased plants. So as a general rule, basically, I would recommend pulling up anything that is done. So like I went through my garden today, all the basil plants were totally toast. And so I just pulled them out of the ground, put those in the compost pile. All the hot crops are done. Probably in my garden personally, I'll have some kale, some chard that's still doing okay, and then I have some spinach started. Everything else I'm pulling out, and then what I'm going to be doing is mulching. So very, very, very important, very, very, very important, is mulching to protect your soil over the winter. And why I say that is because it actually saves you work, and it's gonna make your garden better in the future. If you don't mulch, will you still be able to garden next year? Yes, of course. But adding mulch basically prevents the soil from compaction and erosion. So basically, during the winter months, with no leaves on the trees, the winds will tend to get really intense, and we'll have lots of rain, and or I'm sorry, there'll be snow, and so like it's basically all that to say that it's really intense on the soil. It compacts it. It kind of negatively affects the soil, and we really want to, soil is basically living. There are millions of little microorganisms that live in the soil that function to work with us to help us grow our gardens. They help us, healthy living soil means a healthy living garden. So the best thing to do, and this really applies, coming back to that person that was asking about raised beds, this is one of those ones I want you to really key in on, is you want to put mulch down in the beds and cover all the soil as best as you can. So the options for that are, the best two options are leaves and straw. You don't really want to put wood chips in your vegetable beds because they're high in carbon, which can tend, one thing is they're high in carbon, which can tend to like tie up nitrogen or like nutrients that you would need for plant growth. But I think more importantly is that wood chips are chunky and they take a long time to break down in the soil. So if you're going to like turn over your beds and get ready to plant seeds, wood chips all tangled in there is not going to really bode well for those seeds to be in the environment that they want to grow and thrive. Whereas leaves and straw are great because they break down much quicker, and they're porous. If you're using leaves, I definitely would recommend mulching the leaves, so running your lawnmower over them to chop them up smaller. So because if they're full leaves, especially leaves like oak leaves that are really will tend to mat, and they just create this like thick sheet that the water cannot penetrate. So that's also not a great thing. It particularly, particularly if you're trying to grow in it, I guess for a winter blanket, whole leaves are fine. Another benefit of shredded leaves is they tend to stay put better. Once you like on a windy day, if you don't have shredded leaves, that will blow around your garden and you'll be like, I just put this whole blanket down on this garden and now they're all over the yard. So and then straw, straw is probably the ideal option, but you gotta acquire straw. Either, usually it's between $5 and $7 a bale, which isn't terrible, but it's not cheap. You can sometimes, like maybe there's a store in your neighborhood or someplace locally that is using straw bales for Halloween or Thanksgiving decoration, and maybe you could approach them about if they want to give, if you could have the hay bale when they're done with their decorations, which is something we've definitely done in the past. So cover the soil, cover the soil, cover the soil. Another one is if you have fruit trees in particular, not shrubs, not raspberries or blackberries, you don't really need to worry about them so much. But you should definitely think about putting tree guards on fruit trees if you can, which will give them a little bit of protection from free. It's usually they're white so that they reflect light, and if there's any kind of freeze and thaw, it can prevent any kind of risk around cracking bark. Also gives some protection, and this is probably the more important one, from any kind of rodent damage. If the rodents are getting hungry in the winter, they sometimes will eat the bark of the trees. Okay, so now we're thinking about compost piles and what things we would do for, things to consider doing for your compost pile before the season winds out. If you don't have a compost pile, maybe this is the time to start one, which you could do quite easily. You can see in this picture here is a real simple do-it-yourself compost pile made out of pallets. We actually have a little one-page document on our website on how to make pallet compost bins. You don't have to have a bin. You can just do it in a pile, but it just helps it keep nice and tidy. And since you're going to be doing all this cleanup in the garden and removing this plant material, a space to put it in your compost pot, in your yard, having a designated spot to have it break down to ultimately become future fertility for the rest of the garden is not a bad idea. If you already have a compost pile, maybe one or two turns before turning it once or twice before we start to get freezing weather, we'll get it to we'll stimulate it to start to cook, and get you on the path to having a finished product by springtime. Usually, when I strategize making a compost pile, I'll kind of set it up with stock material. So we have the greens and the browns, and I'll have piles of each of those. And then when I have enough of them, I'll actually build the pile, or I'll kind of build it as I go. It's a kind of manage, whether I'm managing waste or I'm doing this for fertility. But either way, you're just trying to layer greens, which would be grass clippings and all that fresh leafy greeny stuff that's coming out of taking down your garden, and anything that if you left in a pile that it would stink, like kitchen scraps and things of that sort. And then browns would be all those shredded leaves that you're picking up around the city, for stockpiling for using in your garden. And then wetting the material as you go is a good way to kind of get the compost pile primed for for the end of the season. So I didn't talk about yet what I just thought about that with talking about leaves. Is one other tip I would have is to encourage, leaves are a real useful in the garden because we're using it for mulch to keep the soil protected, and we are also we can also stockpile it for use with our compost pile, and for for next season. So what oftentimes I will do is I'll go around my neighborhood on pickup day and grab their bags of leaves and keep them at the back of my garden, and I'll be using those all of the next year for my compost pile, for mulching, for all kinds of stuff. So they're real useful reasons. Definitely something to consider for your own space.
Okay, Keto, I do have some questions, or there are some questions.
Uh-huh.
One, where would you put strawberry plants for the winter?
Well, if your strawberries are planted in the ground in the garden, you don't really need to do anything with them aside from maybe a little bit of straw mulch would be a benefit. It'll give them a little bit of protection. It'll give a little buffer to the crown, so because they're developing what will be the fruit. The beginnings of that is already starting now. So just a little bit of mulch. You don't need to dig them up or anything like that.
Okay, can you put out compost that's not fully finished? Will it finish over the winter?
Well, it depends on how unfinished it is. If it's like just fresh out the kitchen scraps, then probably not. But if it's like kind of middling, it's slightly decomposed, maybe. I mean, one strategy there is like you could dig holes in your garden and like bury it, and then that probably would give it direct access to the worms to maybe do quicker work of it, but that's not guaranteed. So like, if you think about compost, once you get some experience with it, is that there are many different sizes and shapes of plant material that are breaking down, and some of them have higher carbon content, and some of them, like a watermelon will break down really pretty quickly, and fruit will break down really quickly, whereas like things that are high in carbon will break down slow. So when we are trying to get to the finished product of compost, it's all mixed together. There's stuff that's fully decomposed, and there's stuff that's not decomposed at all. And so that's when we're filtering it. We're using some kind of screening system. Just like one way I use sometimes is using a milk crate with a screen in the bottom of it. And I can, so yeah, I guess that all that to say maybe, maybe not, and it depends on the state of your compost.
Do you cover raised beds with plain cardboard boxes?
I think I like the, it's not a terrible, yeah, you could do that, yes, is the short answer, yes, you could do that. I
Okay.
think I would recommend shredded leaves more, or maybe a combination, shredded leaves and then cardboard and then something to weigh it down.
Okay.
So, excuse me 1 second. Okay. Somebody is, my little one is upset. Okay, everything's okay. So yeah, I would say shredded leaves, and then cardboard. Yeah, but cardboard isn't a terrible idea. I mean, if you know, I get the train of thought there. You're trying to protect the soil, and that would be, you know, a functional way to do that. So not a terrible idea. Play with that. Yep. Just want something to weigh it down.
Do you recommend using soil over leaves? Yeah,
Yes.
over the leaves.
Yes, yes, yes. Great idea. Thank you for bringing that up. Actually, it's a wonderful idea. Or compost. It's also a good time of year to like add, you know, so actually, it's really helpful to prevent the leaves from blowing around when we get those blustery. So definitely a good idea. Yes.
Mhm. Do you add weed and feed at the end of the season?
I do not recommend using weed and feed for a vegetable garden. Generally, we like, you know, our kind of Keep Growing Detroit's perspective is that we recommend, you know, we're really advocates of not using any kind of chemicals. And weed and feed is one of those things that's it's, you know, it's a chemical that's used to kill the weeds and also add fertility. You know, if that's something that, you know, I don't, you know, I don't feel as strongly about it for like perennial gardens. And honestly, I don't have a good answer to that. I don't have enough familiarity about like when's the best time to use it. My inclination is to think that it would probably be more functional to use during the active growing season. But I'm sure if you read the label, it's going to tell you. But I would just, and I would definitely read the label to have an understanding of like what's in there, you know, because if you're eating food out of this garden, like what's in there that
That's right.
might affect you.
Should we mulch before the first frost?
If you can, but if the first frost comes and goes, then, and you haven't mulched yet, then you know, time is when you got time. If
Okay,
you got time, when you got time.
I'm going to combine this next one. What type of straw should be utilized, and is hay and straw the same?
Okay. Hay is for horses. Just remember that. So hay is for horses means that hay is the part, is the nutritional part for the horse, which is essentially that's the grain, that's the seed. And so we do not want to use hay in our gardens because that's the seed. We don't want a bunch of grass growing up in our vegetables.
Okay.
I don't know, like there's types of straw, is, you know, you get what you when you get a hay bale. I definitely have gotten hay bales that had straw in them that should have been. So yeah, so I that's about all I can say about that.
I covered my raised bed with roll cover. Some folks say they bring their dirt in the garage or basement. What are your thoughts on that?
Like taking the soil out of the raised bed and taking it inside.
I guess that's what they mean.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Unnecessary. I don't, there's no need to do that. I was gonna, so what I would say about that, like if you are growing in containers, particularly if you're growing in like pots that are like clay pots or stone pots or any kind of material like that, I would recommend taking the soil out of the pot or putting pots in your garage. Basically, if you leave the pots outside in the garden, and they're fragile or somewhat fragile, if they get wet and then they freeze and thaw, the pots will crack or break down over time. If you're to kind of salvage your pots, that's something to consider. But for the raised beds, no, just you could just, if you do that mulching, you're adding compost every year, there's no need to like put that in the garage or the basement.
Okay, somebody, could they mute, can they mute their, because it's noisy. Okay, now, let me see, somebody, this session will be available. Somebody missed that part when you said that it will be
Yeah,
available.
we're gonna record and we're gonna share the slides.
Okay, what about no-till gardening? Like not pulling up roots, but cutting plants at the level of soil and removing the green parts of the plant when cleaning up the garden?
Right, so no-till, no-till doesn't mean well, there's a number of different approaches to no-till, so, might wanna go there yet. Hold on. So the using the leaves, and is a kind of a factor of no-till, or an aspect of no-till, that strategy that people use for no-till approaches. And that because it helps prevent compaction. You're still going to need to loosen your soil every year. So like, whether that be with a digging fork or a broad fork of something like that. But you still need to like, prepare your soil. No-till doesn't mean do nothing. It means don't use a tiller. It means minimally disturb the soil, but you still need to prepare it, like loosen the soil to prepare it for seed beds and things of that sort. Okay. We good? Second here. Okay, I want to keep going. Oh, you know what? Well, I don't remember if I. Okay. One other thing I want to say about covering the soil is a strategy, and this particularly applies if you have a larger garden. Is there's the newer no-till, this made me think of it, the no-till technique, of using black plastic or what's called a silage tarp, which is basically using a large thick tarp to cover the soil. It acts as a protection from that erosion and compaction, and it also limits the garden's ability for weed seed germination. So this is a strategy for like, it could be used for starting a brand new bed. So you could put that big plastic tarp now to prepare the garden for next year, to kill the grass off or to kill off the plants, and putting down weights and everything to limit the germination and to cause the plants to die back and decompose that are existing there. So that is another strategy to think about. Okay, so next, and so this is one that another one that I think is a real important one to remember, that I want everybody to kind of keep in the back of their minds is this is a perfect time of year to take a look at your garden and evaluate how things went, and use that as a tool for making your garden even better next year. So take a minute with a scrap piece of paper and sketch out what was where, and maybe make some notes on what did you grow this year and how much, what went well, what didn't go well. So basically, like, okay, uh I grew 8 tomato plants, and I didn't have enough tomatoes. I wanted more tomatoes, so I'm going to grow 10 next year, and make myself a note. Or I don't let's see, I don't like I'm just making this up. I don't like okra. I don't know why I planted it. I'm not going to grow okra next year. All that kind of stuff. Um, so, thinking about more what to plant more of, what to plant less of. Um, also, uh, any kind of notes on what you might do, uh, move around or do differently, or strategize for like changes in the overall aesthetic of your garden. If you're going to expand, are you going to make more, make grow more beds, and what would you plant there? And so, all that to say is, while it's kind of still relatively fresh in your mind and you see where things are at, and you can have that, you can reflect on the kind of harvests that you were getting from these plants, what to consider for, what to do for next year. Also, a note for planning is, as the fall sets in, is a good time to order seed catalogs to get to have some things, some garden stimulus during the winter months, and look at all the new varieties and think about maybe something new and exciting that you might want to grow. There's some great seed companies out there like Johnny's Selected Seeds, or Fedco, or High Mowing, Guernseys. There's lots and lots of them. Um, and the catalogs are typically free. So that's just something to think about. Okay, and yeah, so and I guess I jumped the gun on this one a little bit, but essentially preparing new growing areas. So I had mentioned the black plastic or the silage tarp to solarize a new spot. You could also use a lasagna garden method, which is kind of illustrated in this picture here, which basically, if you're wanting to like start a new garden bed, you can put down cardboard or newspaper to smother the grass, and then you want to put layers of grass clippings and leaves and compost or soil on top of that as a weight, and to add pressure to ultimately decompose that grass. And it works really well. It can take 3 to 6 months for this to really work well. So that's why that works out really, it's a good idea to think about doing this now. If it's a new garden, or if you haven't done a garden test in a while, maybe it's a good time of year to do a soil test to get a sense of where you're at with fertility, especially if you've been adding compost for a number of years, or trying to work on your garden and improve the quality of your soil. Fall is definitely a really good time to think about that. I did talk about this a bit already. So containers and pots, just as the season's winding down and you're doing your cleanup, you can winterize the pots by either removing the soil and storing the pots indoors, or just inverting the pots outside and covering them. You can definitely recycle potting mix. So potting mix is different than garden soil. So I would keep it separate from your garden soil. So potting mix typically is got a lot of peat moss, or core, or other kind of lightweight materials in it. We don't want to use standard soil in pots, particularly smaller pots, because it tends to get really compacted and the roots of the plants struggle to develop. So you can kind of reinvigorate your potting soil by mixing it with some shredded leaves and maybe a little bit of organic fertilizer, and then putting it in a trash can or just in a pile in the corner of your garden. And then you next year, when you're getting ready to get your pots set up again, you can just go access that trash can or that pile and fill up your pots, and you're ready to go. Just a side note while I'm thinking about pots is if you have really large pots and your soil is not cheap all the time, you kind of fill up the bulk part. You can fill up the bottom of those pots with crushed up cell packs. Works out really nicely to fill up the bottom of the pot, and then you only really need to have soil in the top 6 to 8 inches. As a side note. Okay, trees and shrubs, and this applies to everything, including fruit plants like raspberries and blackberries and all those kind of things. Anything that is a woody plant, you want to avoid pruning at this time of year, because you basically, if you prune a plant, you are creating an open wound, and you want that wound to be able to heal. Otherwise, it is a vector, is a potential problem for disease to get into the plant and cause issues. And if we are in basically, if you're pruning at this time of year, the plants do not have. They're putting all their energy into storing in their roots at this time of year. They're not actively growing. So any kind of pruning you want to do when the plants are dormant. So that said, like pruning a lot of fruit trees, we do during the winter time, closer to the spring. So we want to, basically, if you think about disease problems or any kind of pest problems in the dead of winter, there's no funguses around, there's no bacteria there, all that stuff is dormant or under a layer of snow. So, late spring, February through April is really a really great time for pruning stuff. And to give it, to do the work that you need to do, removing the dead, diseased, and dying, and getting the plant ready and shaped up for the season to come, would be during those winter months. One exception would be in some cases, like heading back, or what's called heading back plants. Like, if you have on blackberries and raspberries, you have those, if you get those really long trailers that are going up and basically touching the ground again, you can, do a few clips and cut them back to like 3 or 4 feet. I would actually probably more recommend that a little bit, maybe closer, give or a little slightly earlier in the fall, like maybe in September. And then finally, you want to definitely, you want to do some good mulching around fruit trees. But you want to make sure that you remove the leaves of that. So like if you have an apple tree, you want all the leaves from below the apple tree to be removed from the base of that tree. So if there's any kind of leaf-borne diseases, you're not reintroducing them as they decompose below the plant. But all the trees will definitely benefit from wood chip mulch.
Okay, we have some questions. Let me see. I have 2 crepe myrtles in pots that are too big to move. How do I winterize them?
How big are the pots?
I don't know. They said too big to move.
Okay. So next best option would be protecting them somehow. So, and here, she said a crepe myrtle?
Yeah, CREPE myrtles.
2 crepe myrtles, and the pot is as big as your arms were if you put them out. So I don't remember the diameter,
Uh-huh.
and they're only maybe 2 feet tall.
Okay. Well, it might, are they on like, are they on some steps or are they on the ground somewhere?
No, they're on the deck.
Okay. So I probably would like, what you could do is it might be worth investing in, like a dolly of some sort. You can either get dollies that are like 3 wheels, 3 or 4 wheels that you could put under the planter, or you could just get your, just the standard, like, moving furniture dolly, um, with in a strap, and then you could wheel them to close to the house and use some burlap tarp around them. I'm not super familiar with like the needs of crepe myrtle, but generally speaking, like if it's a deciduous tree, um, if they're in pots, basically they're a little more susceptible to the really cold weather. Whereas if they were in the ground, they would be less so because they have the buffer of the ambient or the geothermal heat that's coming from the earth. Um, so there's a couple things there. You want to make sure that the trees survive, and you also want to make sure that the pots don't crack. So if you were able to kind of get them off to the side on the deck, like up close to the house, with some kind of burlap protecting the tree. So those are the thoughts I have.
Okay, thank you.
How do I protect grapevines for the winter?
Grapevines are another one that don't really need much protection. They're super hardy. They can really take some cold temps. Mulching around the base of the plant is a benefit. That would probably be the only thing I do. And then just anticipate pruning in the spring, because you should be pruning grapes every spring.
Okay. Should we compost weeds?
If it is, you should compost weeds if there are no seeds, like no seed heads, or no fully developed seed heads. If they're immature seeds, that's fine. And B, they're not like root spreaders, like quackgrass or any of those kind of with the stolons. Like if there's any kind of, if they spread via roots, if it's like bindweed, anything like that, do not put it in your compost pile, put it in the garbage, because they will continue to spread because of that. So, but if it's like you pulled up some, I don't know, dandelion that didn't have a flower head on it, that's fine.
Okay. I guess this is had them from 1999. That fold up, I guess that was for the things that move.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
The wheel dollies. Yeah.
Wheel dollies, right.
Oh, cool.
Okay, that's it.
Okay. All right. So if you're on your game, this is a really good time of year to also do some tool maintenance, cleaning up your shovels. Tools will last a lifetime if we take good care of them. I'm good at this sometimes, and sometimes I'm not. I try to at least keep my tools organized, but a little bit of organizing goes a long way. So if you're current hardships for future gains, or if investing in your springtime happiness would be doing a little cleaning and organizing in your garage, and cleaning up your tools a little bit so they'll last a long time. Doing some sharpening on your pruners and loppers, Definitely remember to shut off your outdoor water spigots and undo your hoses and store them. You can leave your hoses outdoors on any kind of hanger, but they'll last longer if you put them up somewhere, even if you put them under a tarp, and you make sure that they're drained. You want to make sure you do that. And finally, is thinking about if you are just itching to grow something green, or have something green in your life, think about starting an indoor growing setup. We'll definitely be having some classes on this once after the beginning of the year, like we did this at the beginning of this year. But setting up an indoor growing setup for things like lettuce, like right here, you can see all this lettuce is ready to be harvested. So, or some of the herbs that we discussed earlier, playing around with that. But it's a minimal investment to get set up, lights and some pots and potting soil and some little stuff, and it's relatively easy to do. And we actually, if you're interested, we still have those videos up from the springtime, so those are worth checking out. Okay, so
Wait a minute. Oh, where am I?
okay, so I just
Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah.
Someone wants to know, can they plant ginger now?
No, ginger is, if you want to grow ginger, it's a little bit tricky unless you have some kind of greenhouse or some kind of extended protection, but you could play around with doing it in pots so you could take it indoors at the end of the season. But that's something that you would want to start early, probably start in, I think we usually start them, we start sprouting them in March. So you want to put them like in a flat, lay them flat in an open flat of soil, like a those rectangular black plastic flats with soil around them, just lightly, just barely covering the top, and then keep those moist and around 75 degrees until they start to sprout. And then once the last frost is, we've passed the last frost, you can pot them up outdoors. And then they look kind of like cannas as they grow up. And then as we like, I think we have some in the greenhouse at the KGD farm. I think if they haven't harvested already, they're getting ready to harvest. But it needs all season to multiply.
Okay.
Okay, question. My cabbage have just started curling. Is it too late? Should I pull them up?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think I got it now. Thank you, Lorraine. You have been great.
Thanks. Okay.
I'm off of the presentation so I can see it now.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so cabbages, they're just starting to head up is what I'm hearing. Is so if they haven't started heading yet, probably I mean, it is a cold crop. If you could do everything else and see what like maybe we have a relatively warm fall and you have another month, so why not try? Is what I would say on cabbage. Okay, next question. What's a good month to start spring seeds indoors? Excellent question. Excellent. And the reason I say that is because when it's just really easy to just be like, I'm so excited about growing some stuff indoors, I'm just going to start it now. And like you have tomato plants in the middle of December that are like 1 foot tall and you have nowhere to put them. So generally speaking, you can look at some of the catalogs for reference, and it's different for the different crops. But I would say that like we are not starting most things, like the earliest we're starting anything is February, and then March, and February and March are probably the if you're starting things indoors to ultimately plant out in the garden, February and March is like kind of the time frame, and it's specific to each one of those things. each one of those, each whatever crop you're planning to do. But you can also work backwards from the last frost date. So you can see usually, some things need 2 to 3 weeks or up to a month to like be up to transplant size. So if our last frost date is around May 10th, remember that it's my birthday. I'm just kidding. So then you can, kind of work backwards. So about a month, like, March, April timeframe. So that's the quick and dirty. Okay, moving on. Next question. When you plant turmeric, is basically the same, general, legit, same general, MO as ginger. So that would be, starting to germinate them in March and that kind of thing. Do we plant bulbs like tulips, petunias, etc. now? Tulips, yes. Petunias, no. Petunia is more a spring one. Bulbs, but wait, are petunias a bulb? I'm not here. I'm totally. But yes, basically a lot of the bulbs, yes, this is the time of year. One sec. Okay. I'm curious about that. Petunias. I'm just not having an image in my mind right now. Yeah, usually you buy petunias are annuals. You buy them as a plant. They're not a bulb. Okay. Okay. How's everybody doing? Okay. Well, that's what I had to share today. I think I covered a lot of bases. Definitely want to open it up if anybody has questions about anything else that's going on, or you have something that's on your mind. But if not, we can kind of wrap things up a little bit early today. So what you got? Anybody else? Okay, there you go. When do you cut back asparagus? Another very good question. Thanks, Anthony. So if you're not familiar with the habit of asparagus, so what happens is in the springtime, it sends up what we know to be asparagus, which is the immature frond. Frond, is that the right word? Anyways, the immature leaf stem before basically what it turns into is a big fern. It looks like this very ferny. It gets up to 5 or 6 feet tall. This big, airy, ferny, stem. That is what ultimately the asparagus stalk will turn into. I think you technically can cut it back in the fall, but what I know most farmers to do is to leave it for the winter time and cut it back in the spring. So that would be my advice on that. Okay, next question. Is it proper to plant early spring flowers that handle frost? And as the dew plant vegetables in this, and as the dew plant veggies in the same bed? It sounds like you were asking about, can I plant early spring flowers before the veggies? Kind of before I'm doing my other stuff in the vegetable garden. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say, yeah, play around with it. I think a common thing that people do, and it's just hard not to do, is to plant too much, to pack too much stuff in the area. we tend to plant, we get transplants that are 6 inches tall and we think that they're going to stay that size. And ultimately they get to be huge. And so, again, you'll find out, the garden is your teacher, and if you try something, you'll soon learn how well it's going to work. So I would say, go ahead and experiment, but just keep in mind that if you pack too much into a garden bed, then you're going to have issues with plants not having enough sunlight and getting stunted, or just not developing to their full potential. Question. I'm a new garden resource program member. Where can we get the garlic? Okay. Tell you what, I am going to get the lowdown on. All right. So there should be an announcement in our e-newsletter. You should be getting our e-newsletter. If you are not, I'm going to see if I can find it really quick. Okay, I'm not finding it quickly. They're definitely starting next week, I believe Tuesday. I believe it's just dropping at the farm. You should be able to find it in our e-newsletter. And if you, I'll drop my email in the chat if you still haven't found that information, and we can follow up with each other. Okay, my herb garden is tall. Should I cut them back now? What depends on what kind of herbs you're talking about. So there are some, like sage is a woody herb, so I wouldn't necessarily cut it back really heavy. Whereas, we talked about, we talked, a lot of the herbs, generally speaking, yes, you probably would. It depends on the herb. So if you want to clarify that, then if you want to call off mute, or otherwise, or just drop in the chat, let me know. Okay, Olga, I have strawberries in pots. Can I leave them outside? The hardy ones have burlap in the pots. Yes, you can. Just note that what I was saying earlier about clay pots and potential for them to freeze and break, but if that's not a concern, that's okay. You could also, I would say after the last frost, you could also, after like we have consistent freezing temperatures, you could actually just throw them in your garage to, buffer the freezing and thawing and maybe protect them a little bit. Can you plant wildflower seeds for next year? You could, I would say so planting seeds now, the risk of that is like maybe they germinate and just don't flourish, or you might have more success if you do that same operation in the springtime, where it's like everything's kind of primed to go. But if you got the time now, and you're excited about it, experiment, try it out. I don't think it's a terrible idea, and it is something that, it is not, it's something that some people do. Oh, thanks you, Tanya, for putting that up there. So garlic distributions are next Tuesday, 5 to 7. Thank you. Let's see. Okay, you're clarifying, Tanya, medicine herbs. And you know what? There's lots of medicine. Like I think I need a little bit more specifics. Or if you want, you can also, again, I'm doing this right now. If you want to email me pictures, I could be more specific, but like, the short of it is, if it's herbaceous, if it's just like leafy greens and it's perennial, then it's a choice point. Do you cut it back or not? Like, echinacea is is kind of falls within that category. It's harvested for the roots. But I would leave that one up because, because I was talking about the benefits of the seeds for birds and beneficials. All right, so and then moving on to the next one, Danielle is asking about cutting back sage. So sage is a woody perennial that it'll tend to get bigger and bigger every year unless we have a really hard frost. Sometimes it'll die back really heavy. You don't need to cut it back. You could do a little like late season harvest. You could especially the young tender growth you could remove, but cutting any of the woody growth is going to expose, like I said, cutting back that woody growth exposes potential for, disease problems, though I don't know the sage to have that many problems, but that's the long and the short of that one. Should we totally clear water out of our rain barrels? If so, how should we clean them? That's another good one I should definitely put in the slides is winterizing any kind of rainwater catchment. So you don't have to 100% empty them. You should empty them almost all the way. So the reason for leaving some water in them is like sometimes they tend to walk away. And if you don't want them to walk away, then you can leave water in them because that keeps them being heavy. And a little bit of water freezing in the bottom of a tank is not a big deal. Essentially, you're trying to prevent, the concern is preventing, or the concern is the tank cracking. And then I definitely would advise, if you have the ability to clean them, it's a good idea. And you're just using real like mild soap or simple green or something like that. And then you want to like kind of scrub the inside and then rinse them out. And I know that in some circumstances, that's not really an option to scrub the inside. So, essentially, the recommendation is that rainwater should not be stored for longer than, the general recommendation is that should not be stored for longer than 2 weeks. And after that, you should probably sanitize the water with about a tablespoon of bleach per 100 gallons. So it's not much, it's just a little bit. But you can, like what Olga does is she takes them indoors, or you can just turn them upside down, or you can take the downspout out of them and put it off to the side. And so they're not filling up anymore. Okay. Some great additions here. Thanks for bringing up some other stuff. Okay. Anybody else? How we doing? Okay. Well, if there's not any other questions or comments, I'm going to wrap things up for the night. It's been a pleasure. Lots of good questions tonight. Thanks for participating. It makes my experience so much better when you guys, are asking questions and stuff. If I'm just talking, I feel like I'm talking to myself sometimes. So in any case, hope you got some useful stuff out of that. I definitely will be sharing the slides and the video. And happy fall, everybody. Get your garlic next week, get that stuff planted, get your gardens wrapped up for the winter, and we will see you soon. All right, good night all.
Good night.